National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers 2-day virtual summit. We've titled the event Winning Reforms, Wrap Up and Gear Up, so that we can process our successes and losses of 2020 with an eye toward future work to create politics that put voters first. I'm Kaia Huertos. And this is Luca. I'm the program coordinator for the National Association. I became involved initially in election reform through volunteering with the Independent Voter Project. Yeah, which led me to a position with a nonpartisan digital media firm, IVC Media, where I worked with Unite America, Open Primaries, Bridge Alliance, and the Chamberlain Project. If you didn't catch it, all of those organizations were founding members of NANR. Thank you. NANR was formed to function more like a trade association than a typical political organization. Our goal is to facilitate a shared network of professionals, activists, services in order to break down the barriers that limit competition. I'm honored to say that today's event is hosted by Orman. For most of the speakers, you can expect 5 minutes of talking followed by 5 minutes of questions. Take a moment now to find the Q&A feature on your Zoom menu bar, as all questions will be taken from the Q&A, not the chat. If you have technical difficulties, we recommend updating your Zoom right now. And if you continue to have difficulties, please contact our Zoom team at contact@nonpartisanreformers.org. We will always have somebody ready to respond to you there. After those 5-minute talks, we will have a 50-minute panel moderated by Orman, also with time for audience questions, again through the Q&A. Then we'll have a short break and we'll go right into the networking session, which will break up participants into small groups for small amounts of time in order to get to know each other and each other's work. We wanted to make sure that we continue to facilitate that networking and community among the association. Thank you so much for joining the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers virtual conference. Before I hand it over to Orman and Katherine Gehl to welcome you to the movement, we have a quick video from the NANR board answering this question. What is the most important thing we can do to strengthen our democracy? If you ask me, it's join and invest in NANR.
The most important thing we can do to strengthen our democracy is to continue to build our democracy reform movement as an independent movement, to keep innovating and putting out new policies, new proposals, new ideas.
We need structural electoral reforms in order to move to a system where multiple parties and independents can be represented. Proportional representation should be our goal.
To eliminate closed primaries, which exclude nearly half of the electorate, we would include a lot more voters and we would see a lot less partisanship.
To improve election administration, we need to ensure that all voters have access to a fair, accessible, secure, transparent, efficient, and reliable process.
The most important thing we can do is to work across partisan lines to reform our democracy, just like we hope our leaders work across partisan lines.
To dial back the intensity and the tendency that we have as Americans to call the other party the enemy. And instead, we need to think of them as our colleagues who have a different perspective.
We strengthen our democracy by restoring trust, by fixing the system that we use to pick our leaders and the rules that we use to hold them accountable.
Out of control and corrupted influence of big money in our political system. But we can fix this.
A stronger democracy leaves more choice, more voice, and more competition at the ballot box.
Why we think ranked choice voting is such a timely idea that can just spread like wildfire across the United States. There's no shortage of good things to do. In fact, there's so many you might just want to rank them in order of preference.
Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. While I'm sure we'd all prefer to be meeting in Half Moon Bay or Denver as we have in the past, it's a pleasure to be with all of you nonetheless. Suggesting the last 9 months of managing through the pandemic has been difficult would be an understatement. Our hearts go out to those who have lost loved ones or are themselves suffering through illness or lost opportunity, or who have had to deal with particularly difficult situations as it relates to this unprecedented public health crisis. I think we're all very hopeful that the next time NANR meets, this pandemic will be behind us and we'll be in the same place once again. If there's a silver lining from this current environment, it's that it's allowed us to open up our event to a broader audience. Individuals who I hope are motivated enough by what they hear over the next 2 days to get more actively involved in supporting one of the many great NANR organizations being showcased. For me personally, it's particularly gratifying to see how far this association has come in 3 short years. While NANR was formally pulled together in 2017 when 10 organizations decided to take the leap, it was really born out of numerous conversations among reformers that date back almost a decade. Today, we've grown to nearly 50 dues-paying member organizations and individuals. The goal was to build the institutional support the movement needs to continue passing reforms across the country. To that end, earlier this year, NANR negotiated a data deal with L2 and Citizen Data that helps our members level a playing field that was previously tilted steeply against our efforts. As voter modeling and mapping become more critical to successful campaigns, NANR is taking the steps necessary to fulfill its mission and ensure our members have access to cutting-edge technology. During the pandemic, we've continued to grow our membership, share their successes in our monthly newsletter, and co-host virtual events to spotlight ongoing reform battles. And while the association has been busy fostering communication and building tools, our member organizations have been doing the remarkable work that they will showcase today at a time of monumental importance for our nation. I've often said that passion comes at the intersection of what you enjoy, what you do well, and what you think is important. By every measure, NANR member organizations are doing important work, and they do it well. In this unprecedented year, they also went above and beyond to help ensure a free and fair election that seemed to be under attack almost daily. In the process, they helped our country achieve the highest voter turnout percentage in 120 years, with more voters participating in the process than in any other time in our nation's history. For some of our organizations, this was a diversion from their stated mission. They saw a need and mobilized to fill it. For others, it was the continuation of years of effort. The ability of our member organizations to work in such an aligned and impactful way during these extraordinary times should make all of you deeply proud. With that, I'm going to turn our program over for a few minutes to Katherine Gehl. Katherine is the founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. The Institute grew out of the vital work on the politics industry that Katherine documented in her groundbreaking report published in 2017 by Harvard University. Not only was Katherine's work important as a critical examination of our system, but it also serves as a blueprint for realigning electoral incentives to make our system more responsive to the American people. And it's proven to be a powerful blueprint. In fact, Scott Kendall, who designed the Alaska top 4 primary and ranked choice voting general election reform in Alaska, was inspired by Katherine's report and acknowledges that her work was the catalyst for the reform in Alaska. Katherine, we're excited to hear your perspectives about the moment we're in today and your views on some of the most powerful reforms that we're collectively pursuing.
Oh, Greg, thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here. You know, I'm sure all of us spend an enormous amount of time on these Zoom calls, reaching out to people who don't yet know what we know collectively about this critical importance of changing the way the democracy works so then we can fix other problems that everybody cares about. And I spend tons of my time doing that. And I love doing that, trying to say to people, be a part of what we at NANR are doing. But it's also super energizing to just be looking at a space of Zoom squares where I recognize almost all the names. And I know that you might recognize me and that we're on the same side and we're working towards the same, objectives. It is exciting. And as Greg said, these conversations go back a decade. I wasn't in them at the beginning, and I was able to join when people had already started. And now, I was there at the founding of NANR, and now here we are. So I just want to acknowledge how incredibly exciting this is. And here is also why, because we have these wins. So on November, there were, amongst many things that all the people here worked on and achieved, we had ballot initiatives in Alaska for Final Four voting, in Virginia for nonpartisan redistricting, and in Massachusetts for RCV, and we're 2 for 3. And I want to say that if we look around here, listen to some of the organizations, all members of NANR, who played in those big games: Open Primaries, American Promise, Unite America, Represent Us, FairVote. We also have today Campaign Legal Center, the Arnold Foundation, Citizen Data, and so many of you that I didn't get to mention, and as individuals and as your organizations made a difference here. So this is what it's about. It's good to both celebrate what we've achieved and be happy about where we're going. So thanks for having me today. I will say one quick personal note. I was honored to be asked in 2017 to be the honorary co-chair, in part based on that work that Greg had mentioned in my report out of Harvard Business School. But this year I became an actual dues-paying member. I founded an organization called the Institute for Political Innovation, and we are focused on what we saw as white space. So creating demand for Final Five voting, which is to say, let's change the primary and the voting system, meaning put RCV in at the same time. And that's my key focus, is to say, let's do those pieces together, because of how they work in combination, that transforms the incentives and that changes the way our senators and representatives can work, that they'll have the freedom to solve our problems. So thrilled to be working with all of you. We have some successes. We're a long way from where we need to be, and I know we'll be on lots of calls and hopefully in person. Thank you all.
Thanks, Katherine. That was great to hear from you. Always terrific to get your perspective. I'm actually grateful that Katherine acknowledged the hard work that was done in Massachusetts. While nothing can be more motivating than our successes like Alaska and Virginia, it's important to realize that even when we came up short this cycle, we had much to celebrate. Massachusetts, as an example, was able to secure almost 1.6 million votes for ranked choice voting, 3 times the number that had ever been achieved in any other RCV initiative. No doubt the lessons from Massachusetts will pave the way for other successes in the future. And in Florida, the Open Top 2 Primaries initiative earned a remarkable 5.8 million votes, representing 57% of all the votes cast. Think about that for a minute. Between Massachusetts and Florida, 2 efforts where we didn't prevail, over 7 million of our fellow Americans acknowledged that we can and must do better as a nation. I can't say enough about the important work that's being done by this group. NANR organizations are building pathways to real representation, empowering voters, enfranchising independents, and creating the conditions in our political environment for a thriving third force that doesn't view our country through the lens of red or blue, but rather believes that our democracy can be renewed through innovation and genuine competition to deliver better results for the American people. I'm proud to be associated with NANR and so many of its member organizations. Our goals for the upcoming 2 days are relatively straightforward. We want to share learnings from the 2020 election cycle to strengthen each other's organizations, foster community and collaboration between NANR members and other election reform organizations and leaders so that they can develop the relationships that really transcend these formal gatherings. And there will obviously be some targeted skills training for members. Hopefully, we'll inspire more people to join our movement and engage more fully with member organizations. And so with that said, let's dive right in. Our first video that we're going to see is from Evan McMullin, the co-founder of Stand Up Republic and former independent presidential candidate in 2016, which was really a continuation of decades of work that Evan did and has been doing in the service of our nation. So enjoy this message from Evan.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you, albeit virtually this time. Thank you to NANR for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts. And thank you to all of you who have fought so hard over the last couple of years to advance reforms in Alaska and Virginia and Colorado, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. What you're doing is just so important. I continue to believe that the health of our republic, even the survival of the republic in the long term, depends on us advancing many of these reforms, because right now we're so divided, we're tearing each other apart, and it doesn't need to be that way. Leadership is so important. Our leaders can convince tens of millions of people whether to believe in a thing called truth or democracy, or to believe in the opposite of those things. And so because leadership matters so much, we need to make sure that the incentives for our leaders are appropriate for the kinds of leadership we want to receive, which is more effective in unifying leadership. And the reforms that we're trying to advance and advancing, whether they're independent redistricting or open primaries or ranked choice voting, all of those reforms and others change the incentives and improve the incentives for our leaders. So we need to continue to fight for those things. I know we're all committed to it. I'll share a few thoughts with you as we think about our future work. The first thing is that I think it's just so important that we show that these reforms that we're fighting for can positively impact people's daily lives. We need everyone, every American, to understand that. And frankly, right now, I don't think that's very difficult given the pandemic and the mismanagement of our response and the resulting economic catastrophe, as well as just, the other issues we were facing, whether they be climate or healthcare or the budget or so many other things that just aren't being solved. We need leaders who will fight for solutions, find common ground, and advance real solutions for the American people for these real challenges that they're facing. And so we have an opportunity to make the case to them that the reforms we're fighting for will improve their daily lives. I think we've got to do that. The other thing I would say is that I would just encourage, we all know how important it is to build cross-partisan support for these reforms. And I think that's an area where we can improve. But I especially think we need to improve by building cross-partisan coalitions from day one when we start these initiatives, so that we have people from across the political spectrum as much as it's possible, and I do think it's generally quite possible to build broad ideological coalitions to support these reforms. But we've got to do that from day one in these efforts, from the ground up, and I would strongly encourage us to do that. The last thing I would mention is that a lot of people are very much losing faith in democracy these days, some for legitimate reasons that we well understand, but others for reasons that are not so legitimate. They're being misled by leaders who want them to believe that our elections are rigged in a way that they're not, or that that they're somehow unfair because people had access to vote in safe ways during a pandemic, et cetera. But that general distrust that's growing, especially on the right, provides, I think, an opportunity for us to attract more people to our cause and more people to support these reforms. If we find people out there who are frustrated with our democracy and they don't think it's working well, they may have arrived at that conclusion, not for exactly the right reasons, but regardless, we have a solution. We have solutions for them, and we may be able to win their support to our efforts. So I would encourage us to, consider that perhaps counterintuitive or unexpected opportunity in our campaigns. But once again, thank you so much for all you're doing. I'm so proud to be associated with you, and now that the 2020 election is over, so eager to do anything I can and anything that my organization Stand Up Republic can do to assist your efforts to advance these reforms everywhere in the country. So thank you very much, and be well.
Hi, everybody. I am Mindy Finn. I lead Citizen Data. I also happen to co-found Stand Up Republic with Evan McMullin, who you just heard from. It is my honor to have the opportunity to kick off this conference as the first presenter. And it really is just an honor to be here with this smart, hardworking, change-making, passionate community of reformers. I'm going to launch into a presentation in a moment here. The purpose of this presentation is to share some just key insights and learnings from this past election cycle and the effort to reform and really run an election amid a pandemic. As our introducing speakers said, this has been a really unexpected year, and it is just even more impressive the amount of progress that was achieved amid this pandemic. Here at Citizen Data, we certainly expected and prepared to help support and work with those advancing electoral reforms. And then what ended up happening is we also spent a lot of time supporting those who just had to focus and on a new way on running an election given the pandemic environment. I'm going to share my screen. Just taking a giant step back. As Greg Orman said, this is a field that for years has been layering on additional capacity to be more strategic and more effective. Just over a year and a half ago, we launched Citizen Data to help solve a specific problem. And that problem is that this movement, nonpartisan reformers, those who were looking to advance reform in the public interest, weren't benefiting from the same best-in-class data, tools, and insights as the Democratic machine and the Republican machine. As we stood up, we sought to offer a whole suite of services: voter data, survey research, predictive modeling, audience targeting, visualization, and engagement tools, with the idea that this could become a shared utility to both support and scale and help make this community be more effective in your goals. One of those key partnerships, I think was mentioned at the outset, was with the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. We partnered with them in this last year to power the voter data offering and voter mapping, and combine that with the other services that are so critical for effectively messaging, targeting, turning out to vote, and winning reforms. One of the key reforms that we worked with this past year that I want to share a few learnings from was ballot measure 2 in Alaska. This measure needs no introduction. Obviously, it is one of the key celebrated wins from the election cycle. We started working with this measure in December of 2019 and did everything from providing voter data to the grassroots, building a grassroots constituency, to powering the campaign with the audiences and the targeting recommendations to get out the vote and build a truly cross-partisan constituency for victory. Just one thing that, this was a very hard-fought win. I know Shea from the campaign manager is going to present later, and I'm sure others will talk about this as well. But sometimes when there's a victory, we have this tendency to think that victory was inevitable. And those of us who have been looking at research in this space, we know that these reforms are popular. And in Alaska, this was the measure, the whole basket of reforms that was part of the measure: ranked choice voting, open primaries, top 4 with ranked choice voting, and campaign finance transparency was popular, but it was still a hard-fought win. In early October, this was a measure that was if you look at the picture, this was from a poll in early October, where it was 50% of the ballot. It was earning support from 50% of voters and 40% opposition, with 10% undecided. This was really a critical moment in the campaign. Kind of peeking back under the hood, what did this actually mean for the campaign and the decisions that it would need to make in order to shore up a victory? Among 7% of those undecideds were Republicans, 27% were Democrats, and 18% were nonpartisans. So even though Republicans made up a disproportionately smaller share of the support base for this measure, though still a healthy base, they were disproportionately a greater number of those who were undecided with just a month to go. Women also made up a disproportionately greater share of those that were undecided. And the campaign's targeting decisions really relied on this kind of insight, the notion that if they were to win this measure, they needed to win over, both keep the Republicans who were already supporting the measure, but win over more Republicans too. I'll also note that we have now done kind of after action research. We ran a survey in the few days leading up to Election Day and on Election Day itself to understand who ended up supporting this measure. We obviously know the number of votes that it got, but it was important to know who were actually the people who supported this measure. And one thing that we found is Well, about 20% of supporters of the measure were Republicans. For both Republicans, Democrats, and nonpartisans, their perception of the measure as a nonpartisan measure weighed heavily on their support. So the more that they were to view it as a nonpartisan measure, the more likely they were to support it. Another thing, I know one thing with this community, what I hear when I'm in meetings is this question of how do we help communicate to the public that the various reforms on the policy agenda relate to each other. They all are part of creating a healthier, more fair and representative political system. How do we do that? And how do we build on reform successes to get more reform successes in the future? One of the things that we did as part of the finance transparency component of this measure, tested for American Promise, how much, if voters knew that this measure would make Alaska the 21st state to adopt the 28th Amendment to further regulate campaign contributions, would they be more likely to support it? And we found that yes, they would. The campaign finance component of the measure was a critical aspect of it for many voters. It actually, for many voters, was the reason that they ended up supporting it, which is, I think, a really important learning as we try to pass the other aspects of the measure in the future, like ranked choice voting and open primaries. They really did depend on the campaign finance components. That's just what the voters showed us and what they said. And that bared out here too, which is even those who weren't supporting the measure, 20% were more likely to support it if they knew it would have even more limitations on campaign finance. The other thing, this was a unique kind of election, and I think it really speaks to the need to stay strategic and to stay nimble and to stay open to adapting strategies. In many states where the vast majority of voters would typically have voted on election day, this became more like an election month, not just after the election with the count, but prior to the election, just because in many states, the majority of voters actually voted by mail or early. And Alaska was no exception to that. So one thing, just by measuring ahead of time, what percentage of the voters were likely to vote on election day versus early versus absentee, really helped the campaign refine its strategy, because the campaign can say, wait, okay, we know that Democrats and our core supporters are most likely to be voting by absentee. So let's send them direct contact, individual contact, personalized contact to make sure they return that absentee ballot. Let's focus our messaging more on them in the 3 weeks, the 2 weeks prior to the election day, and then take a more, take a shift to start focusing more on the Republicans and the Republican women and put vote at home policies into the spotlight. And it became really important for election administrators to, they had never run an election like this. They had never had this many voters voting by mail and early. And we were hearing through partners that they really demanded more resources to be able to predict the volume of not just turnout, but vote by mail and early in-person turnout. We created a dashboard to be able to help our partners do that, partnering with tremendous organizations like the Vote at Home Institute. And this is, these insights about who is likely to vote by mail, who isn't voted by mail, will create a really important foundation as we move to the future and this community looks to advance those policies. There's also just a lot of understanding around what were the kind of interventions that helped voters feel more confident that their vote would be counted and more confident in turning out by various methods, things like ballot tracking, for example. I'll skip through this quickly. I mean, just to say how useful this is, I think we couldn't have expected how important it would be to transparently and accurately predict what turnout would look like in a place like Pennsylvania or vote by mail turnout. This election continues to be kind of challenged and contentious, but that has really nothing to do with how prepared election officials were. They were, and I'll just kind of point to our prediction for vote by mail turnout in Pennsylvania was 99.9% accurate at the voter level, down to the person. And we had it broken down by county. So election officials were prepared and they did everything that they could. The final thing I'll just touch on, there could be so much to cover, is that this movement is just so important to the country. We're trying to, small d, further democratize democracy. In that process, I know many in the movement want to make a priority ensuring that this movement is representative itself, that it is really modeling diversity and equality and fair representation. We've been engaged in a number of efforts, including with the Bridge Alliance and initially with Unite America last year, in assessing the constituency of this field. And by aggregating the membership lists and grassroots members of over a dozen organizations at this point in this field, we've found that there's certainly, it's a bright spot. This field is more vast and more far-reaching than I think a lot of times we realize. On the other hand, it is still really predominantly white and leans more democratic. And so there is certainly room to grow to be fully representative with racial diversity, ideologically diversity, and more. So I'm going to end there. I don't know if there's time for questions. Maybe someone can cue me. If there is, happy to take them. Otherwise, I will pass the torch. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Mindy. My name is Shakira Mills, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone here, depending on where you are in the country. There is one question that we have for you, which says, were any questions about how many people who voted by mail will continue to prefer that method even after this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We know from our partners at National Voter Home Institute that prior to this election, those who chose to vote by mail had a very high likelihood to just continue to use that method over time. We definitely saw this where in their primaries, in like a place like Ohio, for example, they were nearly forced to use vote by mail because there had been a little bit of early voting and then their primary got canceled and then moved to a purely vote by mail primary, presidential preference primary. So 90% of their primary was vote by mail. And that did impact, those people were 8 out of 10 of them chose to vote by mail in the general election. I'd need to crunch the data to see how many of them had never voted by mail before. But in general, what we see in the data is once people use vote by mail, they're likely to do so. Look, vote by mail is also going to be under attack kind of by the president. And so there is going to be some work to do there to ensure that it's truly trusted kind of cross-ideologically and on a cross-partisan basis. So I think that could impact it to some extent. But one thing I should just say is that we actually saw, we were testing this over a period of months, and in around August, September, we saw a dip in the number of people who were planning to vote by mail. And then it ticked up as we got closer to election day. And I think that was because even those who might have been skeptical or feeling that it wasn't a way they voted before, when they received an application in the mail or they received a ballot in the mail, or they saw advertising from their Secretary of State or their local election official or from a political party about it, they became much more connected to how convenient it was. So I do think that, again, just in the data and in kind of what we saw in the patterns headed into election day is that voters are really favorable to the method. They're preferring it. And once they use it, they're much more likely to do so again.
Thank you so much, Mindy.
Got it.
All right. Thanks, Mindy. I'm John Opdycke, president of Open Primaries. I wanted to share just very briefly some thoughts I have about why the issue of reforming the primary system is so relevant and important heading into 2021, and then open it up for questions. Three main reasons. The first is that, as we all know, the issue, the topic of polarization, of tribalism, of division is now front page news in America. And there's a very healthy debate about what polarization is, what's driving it, what will help us heal it, how do we create new environments for new cross-partisan conversations. That work is so important. And the current partisan primary system is an impediment to that work, to healing, to bringing people together. The partisan primary system essentially is designed to force the American people to pick a team at the outset of the electoral season, and to either pick a team, red or blue, or sit out the process. That's very problematic when you kind of impose that structure on voters and actually prevents, I think, a more organic, nonpartisan involvement by the American people. Given the importance of addressing the polarization in the country, the division, the differences, the current partisan primary system is not a help at all. The second reason is that the country is going independent. We just did a deep dive analysis of voter registration trends in the 25 states that use partisan voter registration. The numbers are pretty staggering, and they're only increasing as automatic voter registration gains in acceptance and popularity. By 2035, independent voters will be the largest or second largest group of voters in every state that has partisan registration. An election system, to be democratic, needs to be in sync with the population, and our current partisan primary system is increasingly out of sync with how the American people want to identify themselves. And we need, as a movement, in my opinion, to challenge the conventional wisdom put out by political scientists, which is that there really are no independent voters, that independents are just Democratic leaners or Republican leaners. That's false, and actually helps reinforce a partisan system that's holding the American people back. Third reason, we have, Evan laid this out perfectly. We have complicated, difficult policy issues that we face as a country. If we encumber our elected leaders, legislators, congressional reps, and tell them the way you get elected in this country is you run in a closed party primary system in which the only voters that count are the party base, and then you run in a general election that in 80% of the districts in the country is an afterthought. It's a non-competitive general election. We're sending elected leaders to their legislatures, to Congress, with their hands tied behind their backs. They cannot work with members of the other party. They cannot do creative, innovative coalition building. The only voters that they're incentivized to relate to are their party-based voters. That is a real hindrance to tackling the very thorny, complicated policy issues that we face. Three final thoughts. We now have top 2 open primaries, nonpartisan primaries in California, Nebraska, and Washington State. We have nonpartisan primaries used at the municipal level. We have top 4 in Alaska. Katherine is doing great groundwork to lay the groundwork for top 5, for final 5 voting. We have all these different policy approaches, and people ask me all the time, they say, which is the best one? Which is the most effective one? And something that I think is really important, my belief on that question, is that the best policy solution is that which emerges out of a conversation between us, the reform movement, and local leadership. There is no ideal policy solution in the abstract. We have to engage in a dialogue, in a conversation with on-the-ground activists and leaders, and support the solutions that emerge out of that conversation, as opposed to predetermining it and imposing it. I think that's a very important dynamic that we as a movement have to be attentive to. Final thought, as Greg mentioned, we got 57% of the vote in Florida and lost. We're coming back in 2022 or 2024. That issue is only growing in popularity in Florida. And I would encourage everybody on this Zoom to learn more about the Proposition D for Democracy campaign in St. Louis for the following reason. That was an effort to enact open primaries and approval voting at the municipal level, and it was led by African Americans. That, given what Mindy's laying out, our movement is too white. We're not as diverse as this country. That, with the dynamics in St. Louis of how local African American leaders grabbed this campaign and built with it, is something we, whether or not we work on this issue, should all learn about. So go to Aaron's Zoom tomorrow, learn about the St. Louis campaign. It has a lot of implications for how we architect other campaigns on other issues all over the country.
Hi, John. At the moment, I do not have any questions in the Q&A.
Wow, I just covered everything. That's great. Take it away, Shea.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Mindy, and all of the National Association for Nonpartisan Reformers for putting this together and inviting me. I feel like I'm outranked on this panel by literally everyone. So thank you for having me. I I served as the campaign manager in Alaska for the Yes on 2 for Better Elections, and wanted to talk about basically 4 things that we learned, 4 things that we maybe already knew, but were really integral to the success of the campaign in Alaska from a messaging standpoint. And I think one of the biggest ones is an adherence to nonpartisan messaging, a nonpartisan team, from top to bottom, having a nonpartisan, bipartisan, tripartisan campaign. Because when you get into these, and we heard this from Maine before we got into this campaign, is either opponents are going to try and suck you into a partisan battle and make a nonpartisan ballot initiative partisan, or they're going to try and relitigate former elections. And when you try and do that, and you try and play crystal ball with ranked choice voting or any electoral reform, you're really shooting yourself in the foot and doing something that leads into the next thing that was really important to our victory, is not overselling. You know, everyone on this call really would turn out for an electoral reform, but I'm pretty sure everyone else on this call is already voting. And so what we need to realize in a lot of these campaigns is that they're not going to be something that turns folks out, but they will be something that can persuade people. And really making sure to focus on this problem versus solution type messaging. When you talk about the problem, you talk about our current system, how it gives us, you know, a binary choice of 2 ends of the spectrum, how it doesn't take representation into account when we're electing our next political leaders. And I think the final thing that we learned from Alaska is that people are really ready for these reforms. They're really ready to see the next system, and a system that can better represent them, their neighbors, their communities. People are really ready for change. And it's just making sure that we can continue to communicate in such a way that is being the most credible people in the room on electoral reform. I think those 4 things are really the 4 things I wanted to talk about today, and wanted to open it up for any questions.
At the moment, Shea, I don't have any questions in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Shakira. Please let me know if any pop up.
Thanks, Shea. I think the next thing we have on our agenda is a couple of videos, actually one about the impact of dark money in Alaska, and the other a NANR video. So if that could get queued up, that'd be great.
Here in Alaska, what you can't see sometimes can hurt you. The same is true for our elections. Alaska allows millions in out-of-state dark money to influence who gets elected, and we've all seen the results out of Juneau. Measure 2 fixes the problem, requiring disclosure of special interest campaign spending. Because Alaskans have a fundamental right to know. Let's take back power from dark money special interests and give it to regular Alaskans. Vote yes on Measure 2. Paid for by Yes on 2 for Better Elections. Top 3 contributors: Unite America, Action Now Initiative, and Represent Us.
For the last 100 years, the political establishment has worked to limit competition, divide the electorate, and silence alternative voices. From donor support, polling, legal representation, voter data, to media relations, the two-party institution is stacked against nonpartisan reformers. But for the first time in 100 years, Republicans, Democrats, third-party advocates, and independent organizations are joining forces to level the playing field and demand more representative government. Our members helped bring nonpartisan primaries to the largest state in the union. We helped bring ranked choice voting to Maine and open primaries to Colorado. Imagine now what we can do together. We are nonpartisan reformers, building and leveraging our own institutional knowledge, resources, and strength to create competition, accountability, and better representation. Visit nonpartisanreformers.org to learn more and join.
Yes, this is actually the perfect time to get into questions that have now been posted in Q&A. I do have one for Shea. Kate Feldman wants to know if you have any messaging data that you could share.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head, but why don't I share my email with her and we can share it broadly, or I can just email it over to NANR to share.
That would be great. Thank you so much. And Jason Gren wants to know, what is one thing you felt ABE on ballot measure 2 could have done better?
Ah, great. Thank you, Jason, for your question. For those of you that don't know, Jason was the chair of the ballot measure or one of our 3 co-chairs. And I think one thing we could have done better, and one thing that I am in the process of looking at, is how much change, if any, would have ensued in the results if we had educated folks for a year prior to spinning up the campaign. And I think that if we would have done that, we could have built a larger margin of win. So we won by 1%, for those who don't know, almost 4,000 votes. So it got really, really close at the end. And it was pretty natural as the opposition started spending at an expedited rate there at the end, and didn't really get spun up until the end. And so I think if we would have educated the year before, we could have won by a larger margin. But we'll have more on that in the coming weeks.
Thank you so much. There is one more question. Ted Wetzel wants to know, what were the top few reasons posed by the opposition against RCV?
Yeah, it was pretty parallel to the messaging that we saw out of Maine. And I was not in Maine, did not work on that campaign, but the folks who did win that campaign have been very gracious with their time and kind of mentorship. And so what they saw in Maine was, it's unconstitutional, it's confusing, it's a solution looking for a problem, or vice versa. And so we saw a lot of the same messaging that we saw there. The opposition continues to try and out the nonpartisan ballot initiative, which doesn't end up working. But if they start saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that's what we saw as a big problem when they started getting going. I think that's the message that that would be scary if they brought it up from the beginning.
Shea, someone wants to know, is your background and others who run these campaigns from political party campaign MGMT?
No, so I've never worked for a political party, and I've elected both Democrats, Republicans, and independents. I would say it's definitely different in other states. In Alaska, we have more of an ability to be a consultant that is truly nonpartisan, just by virtue of our political environment. But I would say it's important to find those folks in the lower 48, in the various states where these campaigns are run, to find folks who have worked for all 3 parties and can't really be pasted with a partisan brand.
Josh, who is the executive director of Represent Us, one of the leading reform organizations that's been advocating for ranked choice voting, and importantly, bringing together groups of political reformers in their unrigged conference, and probably has by far the largest convention of political reformers in the country. I think I saw Josh join. If you're ready to speak, Josh, we're ready for you.
Hey, Greg.
Hey, Josh.
Shall I take it away?
It's all yours.
Thanks. Hi, folks. So thanks for having me. NANR continues to be such an important part of all of this work. And, my goal is to give you guys a kind of a quick snapshot of how we are seeing things at the state and local levels in terms of moving these structural reforms that protect our democracy, that promote moderation and integrity in politics, and acknowledge that, you know, this has been a dystopian year, just generally, for sure. I'm sure you guys have talked about it. I've been stuck on 2 other events and meetings this afternoon, so I haven't been able to join this whole thing. But you know, we're in such a sort of moment where the deep political structural dysfunction that most of the people on this Zoom call have been talking about for years, often creating, you know, causing people to start staring at their phones and spacing out because they don't really get it. Well, a lot of it get it now, because now we're starting to see the chickens are coming home to roost in the form of this sort of polarization and extremism that breeds this sort of authoritarianism and the discarding of democracy. I think despite that, it's been pretty cool to see what managed to happen this year. You know, we saw, of course, Alaska with top 4 open primaries and ranked choice voting. You saw Virginia with the ending gerrymandering via ballot measure. Our Oregon passed a campaign finance reform, which was hugely important. And of course, lots of ranked choice voting passed at the city level in 2 cities in California, 2 cities in Minnesota, Boulder, Colorado, and then of course in Arkansas and North Dakota, wonky victories where voters opted to protect the ballot initiative process that's been under siege there. And of course, approval voting won in St. Louis, which is a big deal. And you know, there's all this discussion like, what's better, ranked choice voting or approval voting? You know what? They're all good. We don't even know. We haven't even seen approval voting in action long enough to know if it's better, it's going to work better than ranked choice voting or vice versa. So let 1,000 flowers bloom, and the more the merrier. Let's get a lot of stuff passed. And it's just so exciting to see that, and that people are starting to really embrace this diversity of approach that is America and is this movement. Now, there was some bummers. Massachusetts lost. That was a very over $10 million ranked choice voting ballot initiative campaign in my state where I am here. And we learned a bunch of things from that, which I'm not going to get into because I'm actually going to try to keep to time. What I want to talk about is about the sort of, you know, where are we going in 2021? You might recall a couple of years ago at NANR, I talked about how we have to scale ranked choice voting. And I would argue that while COVID pushed us back quite a bit, ranked choice voting was attempted, never moved forward with a full-fledged campaign, but attempted in Arkansas and North Dakota. And those got brushed back by partisan court decisions that were pretty absurd. We kind of were on the cusp of scaling alternate voting systems this year before COVID hit, and we're going to have to be resilient and understand that once the vaccine hits in 2021, you know, humans don't have very good memories, and we're going to get back to it, and we'll start meeting in person, like at Unrigged Summit later in 2021. We're going to do that, and we're going to get back to that scaled vision. But as we look back at 2020 and we look at the sort of dystopia that has hit us, and particularly just naming it, you know, we have to all be forthright about the challenges of being hardcore nonpartisans, yet also seeing a Republican Party that is beginning to actively work against everything that we're for. And I say that as an independent. I am no big fan of Democrats, but it's something worth being upfront about, and we should discuss it. But like, it's hard to do nonpartisan work when one of the parties is kind of going off the rails. I mean, 17 states saying that we should steal the election against the rightful winner. I don't care if Joe Biden's a Republican or a Democrat, he won the election. So it's something that we're going to have to be forthright and honest about as we go into 2021. Now, there's 3 main fronts that we're going to be fighting on. And I'm saying this not to say, look at us, but more giving you I just want to share kind of how we're thinking of the strategic calculus in 2021 and where there's needs and opportunities, as well as a few things that we're looking at piloting. One of them is there is going to be a hardcore effort to do two things in state legislatures in 2021, both bad. One is to gerrymander the hell out of the states, and the other is to pass so-called reform bills, legislation that are actually designed to disenfranchise voters. And we're going to see both of those things happening. We're going to see the anti-gerrymandering, or rather the rampant gerrymandering occurring in states, particularly swing states, by Republicans. We're going to see the Democrats going full bore in Illinois and Nevada, Oregon and Maryland. Both parties are going to be going into it with technological abilities that are far outweighs what they had in 10 years ago, the last time they did it. And we need to have a very active, engaged movement pushing back against both of these things, the gerrymandering and voter disenfranchisement. Now, on the policy front, we continue apace with a bold set of reforms across the country to sort of ramp up where we left off. I'm going to see if I can't get you guys real quick before I wrap. I'm going to see if I can't get you a look at a map that will sort of give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. We'll go here. I think I can do this, and then here, and if somebody can just tell me if you see this map. Does everybody, Greg, somebody, can you see that okay?
Yep, looks great.
Great. So when you look at the green, there's structural reforms. We're looking at things like ranked choice voting and open primaries that we are piloting and building the groundwork for in all these green states, like in California, Oregon, Washington, Virginia, New Jersey, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri. Looking at vote by mail laws. Yes, vote by mail laws, which it was the vote by mail states that had the best success this year in clear, accurate, and safe voting. Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Alaska, Ohio, New Mexico, Arizona. And the stars you're looking at are all the places we've seen victories in the last couple of years. The orange states are where we're going to see those anti-gerrymandering fights that I mentioned, and the maroon states are where I mentioned you're looking at big assaults on voter enfranchisement. So that's going to be where the action is across the country. It's going to take a doubling down on our efforts. And I think I'll stop there. And for Kaia's sake, I'm going to keep to time and thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Josh. Sam Chang wants to know, what do you think is the most urgent reform for democracy that we need at the moment?
It's really hard to say. It's kind of like somebody asking you which is your favorite kid if you got more than one kid. Not really fair, Sam, but I will say, I think that in terms of the nexus of policy impact and political viability, that is, it's actually possible to win. I do think that the model you saw pass in Alaska this year with top 4 nonpartisan open primaries combined with ranked choice voting, it's a complete game changer. But like I say, the other child is money in politics, which I see Jeff Clements here. It's like so important. The other side is the anti-gerrymandering, which is so part and parcel of the polarization that is gripping our country that we have to fix, and safe and high participation vote by mail and automatic voter registration as well. So I think those 4 are the big 4 for us that kind of sit at that nexus of impact and viability, but others come and go, and we have to be adaptive.
Thank you so much. And there is one more question. What do you feel is the future of vote by mail?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's been obviously heavily polarized by the president, but it's not historically a polarizing issue. In fact, as you probably know, the 3 of the 4 highest participation rate states in the country have full vote by mail, like Colorado, Washington, Hawaii. And it has shown itself to work extraordinarily well. I think what you're going to see is, in the short term, states like Delaware, Vermont, sort of blue states, are going to probably be New Jersey. We're working in those states, sort of because we have opportunity. We'll see it pass in states like that if we do our jobs right. And we're going to have to wait and take a breath until we get to the purple and red states, which are currently kind of reeling. But I do believe that with time and with Trump a little farther back in our rear view mirror, we'll get back in the right kind of communications and organizing. We'll get back to where we were, where we see it for what it is, which is a very straightforward policy that reduces costs by about 40%, that increases turnout by about 14%. It's just a no-brainer, and the fact that anybody would politicize it is just absurd.
Great. Thank you very much, Josh. Terrific to be with you, and good segue. You mentioned Jeff coming up next. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Greg and Josh and everybody here today. How are you? Jeff Clements, President of American Promise. And we are really proud to be part of this great association of nonpartisan reformers. We believe in the American promise that everyone counts, that a free people can govern ourselves effectively. But I think we all know that we have to, if we want to keep that promise before it's too late, we have to address systems, incentives, barriers, behaviors that can actually put voters first and secure the possibility of effective, competent, and representative government. And no one thinks that's working now. Over 90% of Trump voters, 90% of Democrats, most independents, all say they have little or no confidence in Congress. They believe government is run by a few big interests for their own interests and not for the good of the people or the country. And too many, of course, are losing faith in democracy itself. And while there are a lot of complex interlocking reasons for this, I agree with Josh and others who say it's not one reform, it's all of our structural reforms. And many of those are represented here today, addressing the complex interlocking reasons for the collapse in confidence in our system. But at American Promise, we're focused on uniting Americans to take on what we see as the number one problem, the out of control, unlimited election spending. $75 billion in the last decade, $14 billion in the 2020 federal race alone. And while there's some promising engagement of small dollar donors, most of this money is still overwhelmingly coming in by a small group of very, very wealthy interests giving massive amounts of money. And this is the force that creates the systemic corruption that erects massive barriers to new ideas or new candidates or problem solving. It disconnects candidates and elected officials from the interests of their state and their constituents as every election becomes nationalized in a battle of power between the two-party duopoly in Washington. It drives toxic disinformation, alienation, and extreme division. We did a lot of work in Maine this past election, Stand with Maine, uniting Mainers in the face of a $200 million Senate race in a small state of a little over 1 million people for the Susan Collins race. The Maine Sunday Telegram, the biggest statewide paper, gave an editorial in the midst of that, calling for the constitutional amendment we're working on. They said, if you spend $14 billion to make people angry, fearful, divided, and hyperpartisan, people will be angry, fearful, divided, and hyperpartisan. So why don't we just fix it with legislation? Well, we're told we're not allowed to fix it. 3 decades of a divided 5-4 Supreme Court going back and forth on different kinds of alignments, but most famously in the Citizens United case in 2010, has made a hash of the First Amendment and the constitutional rules at the intersection of money, power, and free speech. But does anyone think this current system's advancing free speech or the liberty interests of the American people? You know, my friend in Maine, David Trahan, he's a Republican. He served in the Maine State Senate. He now runs the Maine Sportsmen's Alliance. It's a powerful statewide advocate for hunters, fishermen, Second Amendment rights. Even someone with his kind of platform said recently that his speech, his ideas, the voices of Mainers have been shut down by unlimited outside spending. He said he felt like in this last election, he was under 20 feet of snow in an avalanche and no one could hear him and he couldn't hear his fellow state citizens or the candidates. And unfortunately, the outside money is impairing a lot of the innovation and reforms we're all working for. The Susan Collins race, it's Maine, had ranked choice voting, but it was virtually impossible for the two independents, one on the left, one on the right, to actually get across their views. So the constitutional amendment can permanently fix this, and it's real. It will bring more free speech, more ideas, less corruption, better candidates, better incentives, more time with constituents, less time fundraising, more positive feedback loops for competence, negative feedback loops for incompetence, and it'll break the generational block and power of leadership in the duopoly, where so much of the money is coming through leadership super PACs. 21 states, 850 cities and towns have called for this. 3 out of 4 voters support it. And as Mindy said, it really brings a lot of, because of the massive, overwhelming cross-partisan support, if it's part of other reforms, it helps bring those other reforms across the finish line. And we are working on a state-based strategy to get those states. That's driving the hundreds of supporters we now have in Congress. And we would look forward to working with all of you as we go forward, driving towards a vote in Congress, 2/3 vote in 2024, followed quickly by state ratification. So I see my time is up. We'll open it up for some questions if there are any. And thanks again to everybody for all of your good work and your commitment in this time of great reform and opportunity.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much. There is a question here that says, will AP be supporting another initiative combining transparency of money, open primaries, and RCV, which we saw in Alaska, possibly in 2022?
Yes, great question. So we were really proud to be part of the Alaska effort. It was really focused on open primaries and ranked choice voting and dark money disclosure, and that's all really good. We were really happy to help in our small way, relatively, with that. But it also made Alaska the 21st state. The law actually called for our constitutional amendment, and as Mindy said, that combination may be a wise one, and we would welcome an opportunity to talk with anyone on this call about that kind of combination of a call for a constitutional amendment, put it forward on the communication side, and show the real sort of systemic approach in states in a ballot initiative. So yes, I guess is the short answer, and look forward to talking more about it.
Thank you so much. Our next question says, is an honest ads type of reform needed as a nonpartisan reform?
If that's to me, yes, I think it is a nonpartisan reform. I think, full disclosure, countering misinformation, having reasonable limits so that free speech and ideas and voters are actually heard and can participate. All of those fundamentally are deeply cross-partisan, whether in polling or voting. Over and over again, it's shown. So, and it also seems to me, all of the things that we talk about of innovation, systemic reform, incentives, behaviors, you can't have it in a massive multi-billion-dollar disinformation society. So we have to tackle that for the country as well as for our reforms.
Thank you so much.
Great. I think we also had one other question, if you've got another minute, Jeff, which came from Morgan Draki, who said, what effectively is the substance of your constitutional amendment?
Yeah, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a report we released on Constitution Day called Keep the Promise, America 250, as we drive towards ratification July 4th, 2026, the nation's 250th anniversary. On page 12 of that report, it has the amendment text that we are currently putting out there. One of our approaches is not to say we have the only answer. We think it's the First Amendment in the digital age. Every American can participate in what the language is. But take a look at page 12. And fundamentally, Section 1 describes the values and interests that should be part of the First Amendment balancing. Interests that aren't included now, like the equal rights of all Americans, the interests of the states, the federalism interest of not having every election be nationalized, the integrity of elections. Those are all interests Section 1 defines. Section 2 allows Congress and the states in their respective jurisdictions to enact reasonable limits and effective election spending rules to advance those interests, not for nefarious reasons and not that in ways that aren't even-handed, but to advance those interests. And Section 3 says in doing so, they can distinguish between human beings and natural persons with our rights on the one hand, and what says in unfortunately in not very good lawyer language, juridical persons, but think artificial entities, which is the language it's moving to. And that's not just corporations or unions, it's also in the coming world of AI and all kinds of ways of non-human ways of driving influence in elections. We're going to need to address. And this constitutional amendment is for our time, but it's for all time for Americans. And we think that's an important section. So it's innovative. It came out of a 2-year writing the 28th Amendment engagement of town halls and states across the country with experts, judges, law professors, and most importantly, Americans in every community that we talk to, as well as doing it online. So I'll put it in the chat right now. The details are on page 12, and thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you very much. I think at this point, we're now moving to a couple more videos from the Bridge Summit on Bridging the Divide and a video message from Lisa Savage.
For me, I started to realize, and I think this is true for many of us that are now working in depolarizing and improving civil discourse, we don't get any of the problems that we care about solved if we can't come together across difference to solve them.
Finding these unlikely allies has just become so crucial to the goal that you almost can't do without it.
Right.
You can't go in and say you're a nonpartisan or cross-partisan organization if you don't make that authentic effort to actually try to listen across the aisle.
You can't win without having conservatives, progressives, everybody in between working together.
Leaving aside a particular party, if you actually believe in Drain the Swamp, right, and that message resonated with millions, we're talking about the same issues here.
We are free people who can connect with people freely, and who can influence and work together.
I think that one of the most important things is our joint humanity. Across race, gender, sexuality, and age. And what the Bridge Alliance is attempting to do is allow us to see each other's humanity and uncover the myriad things that are attempting to divide us, and then bring us together.
It's not just taking the middle, it's finding the best from the left, the best from the right, and most importantly, finding the best that hasn't even been created or thought of yet. Being that open-minded to realize that if we expand our mind, we can expand the effectiveness of democracy.
Not only are we creating a next generation of future legislators and future politicians who are going to be willing to work with other people and willing to reach across the aisle and listen to other points of view, but more importantly, we're creating a body of people who are willing to vote, people willing to do work into office. And I think that that's really the movement that this youth stands for.
I can't say that I've always been there. That is where I have grown to, because it is hard in this environment not to be polarized and not to look at everybody else as the enemy. If you look at it as some external force that's imparting that on you to create that division for an ulterior motive, then you get it.
Hi, I'm Lisa Savage, past candidate for U.S. Senate in Maine under ranked choice voting. Running as an independent Green, I earned 40,000 votes, 5% of the total. I was disappointed when the incumbent Susan Collins received a 51% majority in the first round, because in the polls, I consistently earned the most second-round rankings. Our campaign created many educational pieces on RCV as we noticed that voters were still confused about how it works. Both the corporate party candidates ignored ranked choice voting and focused on negative campaigning against each other. The Democrat would not respond to our invitation for preference swapping, but we decided to recommend our followers rank her second anyway to defeat Collins. We shared ballot selfies showing our hashtag #RankLisaFirst and hashtag #VoteBlue2 in action. RCV did determine the outcome of a 2018 2nd District congressional race, and many in Maine would like to see it expanded to include state legislature seats and governor. Stay tuned.
Thank you. I think up next we have Amber McReynolds. Amber is the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute, was the former Secretary of State in Colorado who ultimately helped oversee their vote at home effort there, and is a published author and a real contributor to what we saw in terms of election security and making certain that election and voting was safe in the midst of this pandemic for so many people. So Amber, welcome. The floor is yours.
Good to see everyone, and thanks to NANR for inviting me to be here. First and foremost, this election cycle presented unprecedented challenges for the election official community, but also voters across the country. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this election cycle, and more importantly, there's a lot that the voters have shared and sort of told us through the stories in which they voted. And we can tell that through a lot of the data, but we can also tell it through their perspectives about how the voting process went. For the first time in a presidential election, almost 120 million people, and the numbers are still being finalized, of course, but approximately 120 million people voted prior to Election Day. And that really contributed a very significant change versus previous general election cycles, in that we saw a lot shorter voting lines on Election Day. So go back to 2018, 2016, 2012, 2008, all the way back to Florida 2000, we have a lot of evidence of very long, extremely long voting lines, 5, 6, 7 hours long. And what changed this year is so many people leveraged vote by mail and also early voting, and that reduced those lines on Election Day to the point at which we saw an average wait time in, say, the Atlanta area for 3 minutes versus their 5-hour wait times they had prior. The second big piece that we saw in this election cycle is the impact of election administration and the importance of investing in it, the policy reforms associated with it, and the importance of how those policies are implemented. And what we also found is that election officials, and there's over 9,000 local election official entities. Many people think the Secretary of State run offices. And by the way, I wasn't the Secretary of State of Colorado. I was the Director of Elections in Denver. But thank you, Greg, for the quick promotion there. But secretaries of state don't actually oversee the direct voting process for voters. The local officials do. And there's over 9,000 offices in the country. And more than 500,000 people worked in those offices, worked as election judges, worked as poll workers, and really put their lives at risk to serve voters in the middle of a pandemic. We had amazing recruitment. New judges came into work and support these offices across the country. The sort of third thing to share is that vote by mail was also the most used method of voting this year for the first time. The percentages are, of course, being finalized as states finish and complete their certifications, and as everybody kind of verifies the totals across the country. But it's approaching 50% of all Americans that utilize the vote by mail system. And that's about double from the 2016 election cycle. So we also see through that data that voters like to have options. They like to vote before Election Day. They like to vote at home. And we can leverage that, learn from that, and think about policy changes as we move forward. The next thing I want to highlight is we saw a lot of litigation in this particular election cycle. And part of that is because some of the states' laws on the books in certain states either weren't clear or created controversy within the process itself. And so what that means is there's policy work to do going forward. Our organization was working on that prior to this year. We certainly have made recommendations to states across the country from a policy perspective, and we'll continue to do that. But these sorts of issues are certainly things that we have to learn from 2020 and move forward in a productive way that serves voters. And then the final thing, clearly we had record turnout. A lot of that has to do with the interest in the election, but also because so many more voters, so many Americans across the country had access to more convenient voting options like vote by mail, like voting early, than they ever have. And so we need to work on that. We need to continue to expand on that, while also ensuring that there's integrity in the election process, that there's transparency, and that there's security. So there's a lot of work to do, and I'm really pleased to be here to answer questions and talk about this very important topic here with NANR. Thanks so much.
Hi, Amber.
Hi.
Could you comment on how much of the vote by mail progress in 2020 will become permanent? And is that answer dependent on red states versus blue states?
So we're working on that exact question right now. There's actually quite a few states that have reached out to us already to wanting to make some of these changes permanent. One state that stands out that really had very little vote by mail prior this year is Vermont, and they actually went from very little to sending a ballot to every voter, and they want to consider making those things permanent. There's legislators in other states that are looking at this very thing and saying, you know what, this worked pretty well. How can we make these changes permanent? So I definitely think there's a lot of the improvements, like even just being able to request an absentee ballot online or ballot tracking, some of those more technical changes that occurred will likely last and stay permanent for sure across the country. I do think it depends on the political dynamics in the state. What's interesting is we all hear about the swing states all the time, but what we also don't hear about very much is the fact that Utah mailed a ballot to every voter this year and in prior years, and they are going to keep that on the books. They're very happy with it. Montana mailed a ballot to almost every voter in their state, with the exception of about 2% or so in one county, and Republicans won up and down the ballot in Montana, and Montana voters are very happy with it. So we we're watching that to see what happens there. And then I think there's a category of just simple improvements. So, a lot of states did a lot of vote by mail for the first time, and now they can learn from that experience and make it policy improvements to make it better. So it's just going to vary across the country. The one final thing I would say is I think we do need to have a national conversation about standards at the federal level, because our system is so decentralized, it actually puts our voters and our system at risk of disinformation, because the rules vary so much by state and the deadlines vary so much by state. So I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had at the federal level about at least some minimum standards.
Great, thank you so much. And you actually answered two questions with that one, so that was great. What do you feel is the future of vote by mail? Some people feel that Republican states will try to limit this. And can we get election officials better trained on how to handle this vote by mail trend now?
Yeah, I think the politics are going to vary by state, and we're doing our best to educate folks on how to improve and sort of what it means to improve, because a lot of the issues that we're seeing, actually, that are some of the complaints about it, if you will, are not actually vote by mail, but they're actually voter registration related or list maintenance related. So we're trying to kind of explain that to legislators as well, as what is the real issue that you want to try to address and what's the best way to do that. So I think that this kind of disinformation and lack of understanding of the process has created some issues, and certainly there's going to be a lot of education to do on our part to help legislators understand how to improve these things. And then there are, I think, the general public also needs more education about the election process generally, what's normal, what's not, what to be on the lookout for, that kind of thing, because the disinformation has certainly run rampant this year and created a lot of confusion amongst the public that we're also going to have to work on going forward.
Thank you. And is there anything else that you would offer as to how to increase voter integrity?
Yes, I do, actually. And one of the documents, I mean, we put out a lot of different materials and white papers and documents this year, helping states with how to implement more vote by mail and expand vote by mail. And a couple of them were policy related. One of them was really about implementation and scaling vote by mail. And then one of the final ones that we did was about transparency. And we recommend things like ballot tracking. So Georgia, for instance, had a statewide ballot tracking system. So did California, Nevada, Colorado, Virginia. Ballot tracking really expanded in terms of a lot of states this year. That is one way to improve integrity, because you can track your ballot just like a package throughout the entire process, and you get a confirmation when your ballot's been received for counting at the election office. Another way is that in the document we put out is actually improving transparency amongst election operations. So some of the recommendations we made to election offices were utilized this year. One of them includes streaming the ballot operation process online, so the processing and counting of ballots. We saw that in Philadelphia and Maricopa County, Denver, a lot of Seattle, a lot of jurisdictions around the country really took on to that transparency piece to make their operations more transparent, invite the public in, educate the public on the process itself, set up good procedures and processes for watchers and observers to see into the election process itself. All of those things work together in tandem to improve integrity, improve trust in the process, and we will certainly continue to work on those things going forward.
Thank you so much, Amber.
Sure.
I think we've got Chad Peace, the founder of IVC Media and IVN. Chad, take it away.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, Katherine, for co-hosting today. You know, I hope nobody underestimates the role that Greg and Katherine really served on this. I mean, several years ago, bringing together meetings. I think Greg hosted the last meeting in Kansas City that then became the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. I think the question at the end was, you know, okay, we've gotten together a bunch of times and talked about doing something. So, you know, are we going to put something on the table? And that's where the letter of interest came out, and 10 organizations signed it, really following the principles that, you know, Katherine has articulated in her, in the work that she's done, talking about really what's at the core of the structural problem with trying to reform the system for more accountability. I'll give you a little bit of my background, just to kind of articulate the perspective of why I am still excited about the association and why I wanted to join the association initially. I was approached about 10 years ago by the Independent Voter Project to conduct the voter education effort for the top 2 nonpartisan primary. It was from that experience I really learned about the structural barriers and the difficulty when you have both sides, both the red and the blue side, really not wanting to see success in the reform world. You know, just like any good consultant, I take credit for its success, but really never happened without folks like Charles Munger Jr., who you'll be hearing from later today. The Independent Voter Project, which I've had the honor to work for a long time, who authored the nonpartisan primary. But it was from that experience that then I got to work, I created IVC Media and got to work with other organizations like Unite America, Kara McCormick and Peter Ackerman out in Maine, the folks in Colorado, and really seeing that a lot of us we're standing in the corner throwing pea shots at a major system. And I think what the association can do is let us all understand that we need to have an institution among us that recognizes the interconnectedness necessary to take on the system. That includes people like Mindy Finn and Citizens Data, who are providing the data, the attorneys who are filing lawsuits, the campaign consultants willing to go out there. Remember, most of these campaign consultants, you know, they have to make a living in a partisan world. So if you go on a reform effort that's challenging both the institutions, that's an industry risk. Once we recognize that all of these efforts are interconnected and that we need the attorneys as much as the consultants, as much as the operatives, I think we're getting there. And that's going to give us the greatest opportunity to really create bigger reforms. So the rest of my time, I want to talk about some legal efforts that maybe even some of us in this movement may not connect to the reform efforts we're doing. One right now is in California, being led by the Independent Voter Project, challenging the constitutionality of California's semi-closed primary system. You know, brief history is California has a semi-closed presidential primary because it was the Democratic Party that took the old open primary to the Supreme Court and won. Some little bits of history: that case was actually argued by the Republican Party's attorney. It was decided by Justice Scalia, and it's left California with a constitutionally having an open primary, but actually conducting a semi-closed primary. Why that's important in the reform world is because if you're trying to get a nonpartisan reform, you're trying to open up accountability to the most amount of voters at every stage of the election process. The semi-closed primary forces nonpartisan voters to choose a party that allows them to participate, and in this case, California. That has a substantial, it seems wonky, and to the average voter, you don't expect them to understand all these nuances, but the reality is it has a huge effect on voter turnout among nonpartisan voters. So there's an effort going on right now in California to challenge the constitutionality, essentially arguing that primary elections funded by the taxpayer serve every voter. They're not intended to serve the parties, they're intended to serve the voters. Another one with another person you'll hear from later is Peter Ackerman, is a legal effort challenging the Commission on Presidential Debates. Now, the commission became a little bit more of a national issue this year, but really there's little discussion about the Commission on Presidential Debates itself. Very few people understand that it's a partnership. It's literally a partnership between the Republican and the Democratic Party, and it shouldn't be surprised why it's pretty much impossible for anybody outside the Democratic or Republican Party to get on the presidential debate stage. So, two of the components of that lawsuit include an argument that the Commission on Presidential Debates, a C3 organization, is not a nonpartisan organization like it needs to be for its tax deductible status, but it's actually a bipartisan organization. And another claim is that the 15% rule is not an objective standard, that it's actually designed to prevent additional candidates from getting on the debate stage. So, and I'm probably getting close to the end of my time, but I just want to re-articulate that there's so many things going on. There's tons of things going on that I don't know about, and I like to think my head's in this pretty regularly. But they are all interconnected. And I really believe that there's so much to do. There's so much work to be done. There's so many reforms to get started and to happen, that the best way we can accomplish this, even in our own self-interest, is to look around and figure out the people who are working on these things already, reduce the redundancy amongst ourselves in the space of trying to do the same thing that somebody else is already doing, and leverage our ability to form coalitions, form partnerships, and work together. I think we're getting there, in large credit to folks, Josh Silver and, and Aaron Hamlin. And we had so many folks on this call that have been in the trenches for a long time. And I'm very proud to be a part of this group and really proud to see everybody coming together. So if there's any questions for me, I'm happy to take a deeper dive into anything.
Hi, Chad. Yes. What is exactly next for IVN Media Platform, and how can attendees contribute articles, etc.?
I think that's a great question, and it has a big question mark on it. For those of you who don't know, I helped the Independent Voter Project launch IVN, the Independent Voter Network, about 10 years ago. And our goal was to provide an outlet for folks like ourselves who are working on reforms across the country. Sean Griffiths, who many of you know, has been the chief editor for quite some time now, and I challenge anybody to go head to head with him in their knowledge of the reform space, because he's been reporting and communicating with folks for a long time. Right now, we're doing what we can. Sean's really manning the ship, and we accept submissions from really folks all over the country. To your final question of how do we participate, is simply, contact us at IVN, send an email to Sean at editor@ivn.us. We have a simple etiquette, and anything that's newsworthy, we are happy to publish and to promote to a very large audience. We're about, 500 something thousand on Facebook, of very active, engaged readers. In terms of the future, it's always been a question of fundraising. This space, it's very difficult to raise money in the nonpartisan space, as all of you are aware. And it's even harder to raise money in this space when we're not, IVN's and purpose isn't to create a particular outcome. We don't know whether a reform will pass in state A or a candidate will get elected in state B because you invested in IVN. It's simply, one of those foundational, goes back to the discussion I was having before. We have to see all of this stuff as collectively important to the movement. We have to have news, we have to have education, we have to have attorneys and all that kind of stuff. IVP and myself have been committed to keeping IVN going as long as we can to serve whatever role it can in the space. The question mark will be answered if we're able to get a level of funding that can really take it to the next level.
Great. I think it probably makes sense to move on to the video from Peter Ackerman. Peter has been involved in the reform space in the United States, I should say, given the leadership he's played in the Center for Nonviolent Conflict Resolution internationally. But he's involved and has been involved for quite some time, first with Americans Elect, where he almost single-handedly provided a pathway for a non-Democratic or Republican presidential ticket. And then, as Chad mentioned, with numerous legal challenges trying to open up the presidential debate system, and ultimately supporting things like the Chamberlain Project, who were so active and invested in ranked choice voting in Maine. So if we could cue up the video from Peter, that'd be great.
Every great organization in the United States, whether it's a private company, a philanthropic enterprise, even a government entity, makes progress by having its members offer a thesis about how to go forward. Some disagree and offer an antithesis. And then there's a synthesis. Then they take steps and they go through the process again. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Our political system is one that offers only a thesis and an antithesis, but is incapable of creating the synthesis because the thesis and antithesis represented by the two parties are in collusion to basically ensure that a synthesis never happens because it's not in their interest to make it happen. Now, the only way to get rid of this problem in today's world, I believe, is to create a pathway for unaffiliateds to compete against candidates that are Democratic or Republican. Not necessarily a third party, but people who are unaffiliated with the two parties. Now, we know through polling I've done, with Chad, as a matter of fact, that almost 70% of the American people want more affiliated candidates in power. Now, I've tried to affect that in two ways. First, through Americans Elect, and then the litigation to basically allow a third candidate to compete in the fall debates. Right now, we've litigated against the Federal Election Commission, who oversees the Commission on Presidential Debates, who make these rules. And in the District Court, we won one, lost one, lost in the appeals court, and we've just submitted an appeal to the Supreme Court. And I urge you to take a look at the first 15 pages because of the argument that we make about the importance of unaffiliateds competing. And of course, the next way, probably even more important, is having ranked choice voting displace first past the post voting. And I just want to spend a second about what happened in Massachusetts, because even though we garnered the most votes ever for a ranked choice voting initiative, we lost in Massachusetts, not because we didn't have Democrats on side. We had all the senators, the attorney general, other prominent Democratic people. But at the end of the day, the Republicans did not want to see it happen. And we thought we were winning until the governor, who was the Republican, basically came out against, and we lost. I think the lesson here is that we need to dispel the notion that I think exists in the Republican Party and amongst the Republican community that ranked choice voting is bad for them. And I think we need to start a dialogue. Once they understand that it's not, and they should, because I have Republican friends that told me how upset they are that the Libertarians probably stole the election for Trump, or if you really look at Georgia, if we had an instant runoff, there wouldn't be the runoffs. So the Republicans, with, I think, an effort to jawbone them and share knowledge with them, might come more on side, and I think it'll make the national effort to create ranked choice voting that much easier. So thank you very much for letting me speak, and good luck for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Peter. I think our next speaker is a recently elected delegate to the Virginia House of Delegates, Suha Subramanian. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you so much for everyone for having me here and for putting this great event on. I'm so glad that there are so many like-minded folks like myself who are really care about electoral reform and about trying to achieve cross-partisanship, bipartisanship, and really get out of the funk we're in right now. So my name is Suha Subramanian. I represent the 87th district in the Virginia General Assembly. This is my first term. You've been to the 87th district if you've ever flown through Dulles Airport, and it's Loudoun County and Prince William County, and it's the biggest district in Northern Virginia. And like a lot of Northern Virginia, it's changed quite a bit, and a lot of new people in the area. And recently, I serve on there's 2 or 3 committees, but as a freshman, you don't necessarily get the best committees. But what you can do is, as any other delegates, you can form caucuses if you have an issue that you care about deeply. And a caucus that I formed with several other delegates and Senator Emmett Hanger, a Republican, was called the Commonwealth Caucus. And I'm the co-chair of that with Senator Hanger. It's a bipartisan, bicameral caucus, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But Virginia has something called the Virginia Way. And essentially, this is a lot to do with being respectful and being collaborative with legislators across the aisle. And I think when you look at the relationships between Democratic and Republican legislators, personally, I think I have great relationships. I think all Democrats have great relationships with Republicans and vice versa. And we send each other Christmas cards. We work together on things where it's home cooking and it affects our counties. But this doesn't exactly translate to when the issues really matter, when there's any sort of hot button issue. It's courteous personally, but then there's a lot of games that still happen. And this is kind of also sarcastically referred to as the Virginia Way. Every 10 years, when it comes to redistricting, the party in power is looking to stick it to the party that's not in power. And there'll be a couple personal vendettas when trying to draw districts. And, Virginia, the numbers reflected that. As of 2015, when it came to the health of state democracies, Virginia was 50th out of 51st in the state. Only Alabama ranked lower. And it received an F on a lot of electoral reforms, accessibility to the ballot, representation in state government, a lot of room for improvement in Virginia. And so in 2019 and 2017, there was a shift because of the people moving into districts like mine in Northern Virginia. It was a long time Southern Republican state. Before that, it was a Southern Democratic state. And it started moving in a little bit more progressive direction. As a result, Democrats have majorities in every chamber now, which is the first time in a very long time, first time ever that a progressive Democratic Party has ever had any sort of power, I would say, in all 3 chambers. But it's still pretty divided. It's 21-19 in the Senate, 55-45 in the House. And so, some people saw this as, potential for gridlock, but I think myself and others saw it as an opportunity for, change and for bipartisanship. And so the Commonwealth Caucus served as, at first as, sort of an easy caucus to join for a lot of people because, bipartisanship, who doesn't like bipartisanship, right? Who doesn't like working across the aisle, working across, in a bicameral way with the other bodies. But as the session went on, it started to become sort of a place of refuge for, Republicans and Democrats who felt like, they wanted to make changes and they couldn't because of their own caucus in some cases, or perhaps they wanted to take a stand on an issue and they got a lot of flack from their own colleagues. Perhaps they wanted to work across the aisle, but they felt like, they didn't have the opportunity to do so unless they had others from their own party join them. And so it was a great, effective caucus. was helpful in getting a lot of things passed. We were able to get a lot of electoral reforms done. It was the priority of the Democratic caucus in the first place to improve voter access, but a lot of our Republican colleagues in the Commonwealth caucus joined us and made those Democratic policies into bipartisan improvements. And there were times where Democrats in the Commonwealth caucus actually left their caucus to join Republicans. One very notable example was on redistricting. Democrats wanted to take control over redistricting. Virginia has a process where 2 separate General Assemblies have to pass a redistricting amendment in order to change the Constitution, which is what we're trying to do. So a Republican-led General Assembly actually passed a constitutional amendment taking redistricting essentially out of the hands of the General Assembly and into the hands of a bipartisan and citizen-led committee. And so Republicans passed that and Democrats voted with it. But then when we got into power, there was a change of heart because this might be an opportunity to potentially be in charge of redistricting again for the first time in a long time. And so, but myself and others in the Commonwealth caucus said, we care about electoral reforms, and sometimes we need to put our country and the health of our democracy over what the party may want to do when it comes to redistricting. And so we helped get that bill through and that change into the Constitution, and voters overwhelmingly passed that as well just last month. And so we had low expectations for our first session, but I think that a lot of people now know what the Commonwealth Caucus is and know what we're all about, and know that the individual members have been emboldened to really take a stand and fight for bipartisanship and nonpartisanship. And so, we have a couple other bills that we were able to pass on ranked choice voting. A couple local jurisdictions are going to be basically piloting ranked choice voting, and I think this is something that we'll be able to expand in 2021. And there are a couple other bills that we're looking at for 2021 that are not necessarily electoral reforms. We're talking right now about potentially doing a prescription drug price transparency, and a few others had ideas too. So we're not just focusing on electoral reforms, we're focusing on things where we think that Democrats and Republicans can come together. We're also trying to see if there are issues where, the caucuses are very far apart, but we can sort of be a problem solver in that arena and get the requisite votes to bring 2 caucuses together. So, I'm happy to take more questions, but I think that our experiment and this caucus is the beginning of what I hope will be a nationwide movement towards bipartisanship and bringing that back into style. Because if you're someone who cares about that, this is a bad time for politics right now. It's never been more partisan. A lot of us in the Commonwealth Caucus will be facing primaries because of our stance and because of our participation. But I think we are in a great spot. A lot of it is thanks to folks like you all who have been steadfast in your support. And I think the future looks bright when it comes to trying to make reforms to our democracy, as well as to trying to heal some of the divides that exist in it. So thank you so much for having me here, and I look forward to any questions you may have. What might be changed to be able to help create an environment for bipartisanship and nonpartisanship? And I think in the end, there's a lot of anger right now, and people feel like they're on teams right now, and it's hard to get out of that rhetoric. And honestly, people who are not partisan are seeing that the people who are partisan are getting rewarded. We have members who, I wouldn't say members necessarily in our General Assembly, but across the country, there are a lot of elected officials who they see that the political rhetoric and stunts actually work, and people are responsive to them, and there's energy that's created behind that, and so that encourages more of those types of rhetoric and actions. And so, but I think if nonpartisanship and bipartisanship is rewarded, and we're able to get the word out about how important that is, I think that you'll start to see a shift back. Because in the end, I think policymakers are reactive more so when it comes to political wins than they are proactive. There's very few folks who are proactive, I would say. But if if legislators, are partisan when they're in session, but come home and see that their, folks have been notified and are aware of the fact that, they weren't working across the aisle, weren't getting things done for their district because they weren't open to changes or compromise, then I think they will change the way that they act the next session. We've seen that happen in several fronts.
Terrific. Thank you so much, and congratulations on your win. And thank you for your courage and willingness to put the interests of the Commonwealth ahead of the interests of any particular political party. That's uncommon in politics. At this point, I think we're going to turn it over to the folks at FairVote. I know I saw both Rob and Sanjita are on. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg, to all the people on this great presentation so far. It really is remarkable how far this voters' choice effort has come in these past few years, and the role of ranked choice voting, which has been our particular focus, just keeps moving in all kinds of ways that I think we just wanted to lift up a few parts of that and then talk about the role of strategic planning for what we're doing and what we think the whole movement can benefit from as we sort of scale and keep growing to have the impact that we want to have. Looking at the year, ranked choice voting was on the ballot in 8 places. It won in 7. 6 of those were cities, and that's part of like a growing conversation that's happening all around the country. There's a growing network of groups that are working on ranked choice voting, and that's often the great place to start. And I just wanted to flag that we're having a whole session tomorrow where we're going to talk about some of those city wins and how they, what made them possible, what you can do to build off of them. We also saw, the Democratic Party use ranked choice voting in 4 presidential primaries. That's something that we played a really big role in supporting and making happen. And we're having that same conversation off and on with the Republicans when they sort of admit they may have a crowded field in 2024. But 3 Republican state parties used ranked choice voting at their state conventions to pick major leaders like the new Attorney General of Indiana and the state party chair. And so the idea of the ranked choice ballot is one that is becoming normalized. And then that the role, the impact that we all know that it has can go on top of the fact that it just on a certain level solves problems. And I think there is also an aspect that we just wanted to lift up is that it works. So ranked choice voting was used statewide in Maine. It was used in these presidential primaries. It was used in 10 cities. There was a lot of information at FairVote about how voters are handling it. But again, we're seeing these concerns that people won't be able to count up to 3, doesn't play out, and the voters are embracing it and really making a difference. Before I throw it over to my colleague Sangeeta to tell us about some of the work that we're doing and this idea of what we can do with planning, just want to lift up that just the work continues. So just this afternoon while I'm juggling here, we're trying to support the folks in Common Cause in New York and others in New York City that are defending ranked choice voting right now as it gets set to be used next year. And we just got an amicus brief out in the level of the playing field case that Peter Ackerman was talking about. So things are happening hour by hour. So I want to turn it over to Sangeeta.
Great. Well, thank you. So the intention, I'm going to cover something a little bit different than most of the presenters have done. And as Rob said, we're hoping that this becomes something that other organizations who are also poised for success and scaling can hopefully, take some nuggets from and run with it. So the context for the planning is when I joined FairVote roughly 2 years ago, when ranked choice voting had reached a certain level of interest and growth in the country, and we needed to step back and carve out our own role in light of other new entrants and multiple organizations who were working on ranked choice voting, and FairVote wasn't the only one. There were local, state, and city groups, just an overwhelming interest in ranked choice voting at the time. And I happened to have joined the organization having worked with a set of international organizations that had scaled very fast using a deliberative, planning process, and had scaled in such a manner that I thought, this would be useful for FairVote as well. And because FairVote has played such a key role to advance ranked choice voting, as I said, we needed to engage in a strategic planning process to define our role within and in light of the new players. So we actually hired a professional strategic planning expert to help us with the process, and have engaged on that in the last few months. So first, the framing, as Rob said, we actually had a 12-year visioning exercise, if you will. As many of you have spoken, the structural and systemic changes we're trying to bring about aren't easy, and it really has a longer, change timeline, and we needed to acknowledge that. So we started with a 12-year visioning, and just to frame this conversation in terms of the structural and systemic changes we're trying to bring, the two goals we outlined, with a 12-year vision is to make ranked choice voting ballots the norm in all federal and state level elections. So really to normalize the ballots, as Rob just spoke about. And then the second one is to enact proportional ranked choice voting for Congress through Fair Representation Act. With that long-term vision, we then started outlining our 4-year goals. I wish I had a nice PowerPoint with that, but I don't. So the 4 goals we have are these. Enact narrowly tailored tip-of-the-spear reforms in Congress and target states to normalize RCV ballot in line with our 12-year vision. And one example is what Rob just talked about, what's happening in New York City, what we saw in Maine and Alaska, where and the presidential primaries, the use of 5 states using ranked choice voting for in the Democratic primaries is one such, tip of the spear reform that we are championing. The second one is around building coalition and partnerships to pave the way for winning the Fair Representation Act. The third one is to inform and support the RCV movement and to create conditions for expanded state and local adoption of RCV. This is particularly in recognition of FairVote's long-term and historic role in advancing ranked choice voting, that we couldn't, even though there are new entrants, we couldn't just move out. We needed to support the field. So this is particularly in light of that. And then the fourth, last but not least, is around building our organizational infrastructure, whereby the fundamental belief is that without a team and an infrastructure and process and systems in place, we cannot catapult and scale the movement in the way that we intend to. So all this has landed us in a pretty good place. And we're, as we speak, developing implementation plans and building a team around it. And this is also partly informed by, as I said, my experience with other organizations, particularly in the international development field, whereby organizations grew by scaling and depending on institutional donors who actually look for pretty sophisticated levels of planning and long-term visioning exercise that you would see in the planning that we have done. So I think we're maybe running out of time. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Yes, I do have one that says, what are your thoughts on the concern that ranked choice voting squeezes candidates of color out of the field, especially considering that diversifying not only democracy reform, but democracy in itself is a big theme of 2020 and moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting aspects of seeing ranked choice voting play out in actual elections is it is really opening up both the election process to more voices, but who's winning and who's not. So like say in the Bay Area, which has had pretty consistent demographics during the last 20 years where ranked choice voting has been introduced, within a decade of ranked choice voting coming into the 4 cities where about 53 offices are elected by ranked choice voting, it's gone from about 40% of those seats being won by people of color to 60%. And it seems like part of it is just having that general election, that election where the decisive choice happens, having multiple candidates, having more than one person of color, having more than one woman who also have been doing well in the system, and having maximum turnout when the big election happens. There's also a lot of really encouraging data about people really of all backgrounds being able to handle a ranked choice ballot well.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to know, do you think it's better to use ranked choice voting in both the primaries and in general, or is it better to use what Alaska will use in future elections, which are top 4 in the primary, and then use ranked choice for general?
Yeah, I think what Josh Silver was mentioning earlier, let a flowers bloom is the right way. I mean, there's not going to be a single model. The top 4 model, which is a FairVote policy innovation that we developed actually in conversation with Chad and his father, Steve Peace, to say, well, is there a way to not have arguments with the top 2 proponents, but in fact look for something that we could both support together? And I think the top 4 system is a great example of how that works. I think it's going to be very impactful in Alaska, fits the state's political culture, really well, which isn't a binary one. But Maine has ranked choice voting in a certain way. It seems to be really appropriate for Maine. All these cities have just got rid of primaries, right? Except New York. New York's going to keep a primary and then have a general election, but the others are all single elections where all that choice happens at once. So I think we can realize the ranked choice ballot can be used in different ways, have an impact in those different ways, and really make a lot of progress. And I'll say, by the way, look for some big advances in the coming year in Utah, and places like Washington, D.C., like places that are very different politically, I think are going to be moving ranked choice voting, which sort of shows its flexibility as a viable instrument.
Thank you. Sangita, did you have any thoughts on either of those questions?
No, I think on the first question about is this going to squeeze out voters of candidates of color is, I think data already shows that it doesn't necessarily do that, but we need to see more elections happen and for more data to be gathered and for more experiments to be done. So that's what I would say.
And I would just add very briefly, when Sangita was adding, saying what our vision is, we want to change congressional elections to the Fair Representation Act, which is a form of proportional representation. And by definition, a proportional system is inviting more voices in from across the spectrum, and more people from diverse backgrounds and so on. So we'll hear from George Chung soon about what that means, but I think it's important to realize that's also a form of ranked choice voting. And again, it's not just sort of a single thing, it can be used in different ways.
Thank you so much. Greg, are we out of time for Q&A, or do we have time?
I think we are. I think we have to move on. The next thing I believe we have is another video message, this time from Jackie Salet, and also a summit summary from NANR.